And hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another edition of Setting History Straight. It's heard here on various radio internet stations across the great land of the United States of America and in reality, the world. My name is Joey Thompson, and I'm lending commentary to Linda's broadcast from North Georgia. She is in New Orleans, Louisiana. Linda Watson is your host of Setting History Straight.
Thank you for joining me, and we're going to be talking about the early migrations of the Israelites. Now, tonight I'm going to be using some of the material from Stephen Collins's book called Lost Tribes of Israel Found. Now, actually, the Israelites left out and went into Europe at a very early age and time. And so we're going to discuss that tonight. We're going to go through all the proof of that. Some of them actually never made it to the land of Canaan. We're working our way through history, and we want to use history to back up the Bible. Our historians have left the Bible out of history, and they're trying their hardest to disprove it. And so what has happened is we have a corrupted history now because they've left the Bible out of it. We don't have some of the history that we should have. So we especially tonight want to cover some of the history that's left out. So we're going to start with the story of Spain, the history of Spain, and we're going to start with the story of Eber. Now we know Genesis 10 is the Table of Nations. Now around 100 AD, both Hipparchus and Josephus wrote the origins of the Table of Nations. They actually identified the people that were living at that time around the first century and told who they were and compared them back to the Table of Nations. Now, practically every encyclopedia you put your hands on covers the information on the Table of Nations. So this is not anything that's new information. It just may be new to us because we have never heard it. These two men basically identified all the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. Now, all the encyclopedias tell you who these people are in Genesis 10 based on the research of Josephus and Hipparchus. So let's go ahead and identify some of these people. We're going to start reading Genesis 10, verse 22. And the children of Shem were Elam, Ashurah, Arphaxad, Lul, and Aram. Now dropping down to Genesis 10:24, and Arphaxad begat Salah, and Salah begat Eber. Now that makes Eber the great-grandson of Shem. All right, so now Joey, can you tell the audience who the Hebrews were?
Yeah, the father of the Hebrews would have been the man Eber, E-B-E-R. And Eber he was about the seventh generation from the man Noah.
Okay, so Joey, the Hebrews are not just the 12 tribes of Israel, in other words.
Oh, heavens, no. There's, when you talk about the nations that hail from Eber, it's really phenomenal to think about. If you go to the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and just take a look at some of those nations, it's phenomenal. All of the Arabs, whether they descend from Esau or whether they descend from Ishmael, every Arab that lives in the Middle East hail from Shem and certainly from Eber and, as a matter of fact, from Abraham.
Okay, thank you, Joey. Now, there's a book called The World History Compendium online. It's wrote by Herman Hay around the 1920s and 30s. And it talks about Shem being the seventh king of Egypt. Dr. Hay was an authority on the history of Egypt. Now, the interesting thing about Eber is that's how Spain got its name. Now, Spain was not called Spain until almost the time of Columbus when Isabel and Ferdinand were ruling Spain. Now, we're very familiar with those two individuals. Now, right before that time is when they began to call that area Spain. But before that time, it was always called the land of Iberia. Now, that's interesting information because Iberia is named after Eber. Now, we know that the word Hebrew comes from the word Eber also. In the Hebrew language, the word Eber means to cross over. And that's exactly what him and his descendants did as they crossed over from the Mediterranean area into the area that we know now as Spain. And that's actually what he did. God named him for what his job was going to be. His job was to cross over. Now, we should be seeing that there's way too much information out there that's just being left out. Now, the encyclopedia talks about the settlement of Spain, and it says the people arrived in Spain with the dates being as early as the 5th millennia to the 3rd millennia. Now, that fits in perfectly to the time frame of the Bible with the timing of Eber. Now, in the Barbarian Chronicles, which is the oldest history in Europe, covering the history of Germany, early Germany, tells us that Shem took 70 of his relatives and went into Europe. Now, he took 70 of his relatives, and Shem eventually followed back to the area of Spain, or what we call Iberia. Now, they know this is the time frame that people began moving into Europe. Now, we want to prove that there were many Israelites that never went into the land of Canaan. We know that information because of the census that was taken in the book of Numbers. Now, we also know that God was not happy with people taking census. We see that in the story of David, how David was punished for taking a census. So when God actually does a census and puts it in the Bible, then we need to pay attention because he's trying to show us something. So the census in Numbers 1 is a census of the people before they went into the land of Canaan. Now, Numbers 26 is the census of the people that actually went into the land of Canaan. Now, when we compare the two censuses together, we find out in Numbers 26, fewer people went into the land of Canaan. So the question is, what happened to the rest of the people? Where did they go? So the second census tells us that 61,000 males over the age of 20 that were in the first census never went into the land of Canaan. Now, many people said they must have died out, and there was a small little plague that the Bible mentions, and it killed 24,000 people. Now, the census only was taken for the males, so we're talking about something like 200,000 people that we have no record of, that are just did not go into the land of Canaan. So where did these people go? Now, it's possible that some of them could have died out, but 200,000? The Bible would have mentioned that. So it's my theory and many other people's theory that some of these people never actually made it into the promised land, and so they migrated somewhere else. And that just has to be what happened. Well, now we know that if you look at the Irish history, that many of them did travel to Ireland. We have the history of Keating, who wrote the history of Ireland, and he mentions how the Trojan kings took some of the people with him and settled in Ireland. And they also settled in the area of Athens and in the city of Troy. We've covered that in our previous session on the Trojan kings. If you have not heard that, you might want to go back and hear it. I keep a copy of all my programs on my webpage, which is called 12 Tribe History, so you can go back and review that. So we know that information because the Irish history covers that. It covers how the people went into Ireland. So now the real question is, if we had 200,000 people that never went into the land of Canaan, then where did they go? Now that's a real interesting question. Now they're corresponding very closely with the migrations that are happening and being recorded in Europe. Now, in the Bible, the period of the judges was from 1400 to 1100 BC, and the exile from Egypt occurred in 1496. So if you're trying to remember dates and times in the Bible, if you just round them off to hundreds, it makes it easier to remember. So basically, we're thinking about the Israelites moving out of the land of Egypt around 1500s. That'll help you remember dates in the Bible if you round it off. Now, one of the first migrations mentioned was around 1100 BC. Now, I talked about how England, in the past I've talked about how England actually was settled by Brutus around 1100 BC. And the island of England was actually named after him. That's why they call it the British or Britain. It was named after Brutus. Now, Brutus was the grandson of Anytus, who was the first founder of Rome, and he was a Trojan king. He actually came out of the last fall of Troy and went and settled Alba Longa, which is the early name for Rome. So we know that Britain was having migrations into that area around that time frame, and probably a little earlier. And of course, there was people already in Britain when Brutus got there. Some of those people had already started migrating in. Now, the historians just named them basically as the Celtic people. That's what they basically are labeled, the Celtic people. Now, Philip Hitti, who was a Harvard professor, wrote the story of the Arabs in the area of Spain. He actually wrote the Spanish history. Now, he records in his book that the tribe of Gad formed a colony in the area of Iberia in around 1100 BC. It was formed around the present-day town of Gadaz. Now, in early history, it was called Gadaria. They named the town after the tribe of Gad. Now, one of the 12 tribes was the tribe of Gad. I hope everybody knows that. Now, if you remember, Jacob had 12 sons. And those sons were the 12 tribes of Israel, and one of those sons was named Gad. Now, the Rock of Gibraltar is also named after the tribe of Gad. It's very simple to see this information. Now, they didn't call it the Rock of Gibraltar at that time. It was called the Pillar of Hercules. It's really interesting how the historians have picked this information up, and they tell you that one of the tribes of Israel, one of the 12 tribes, went to Spain. And it was the tribe of Gad. Here's a famous historian that's telling you that the tribe of Gad went and settled in Spain. I don't understand how historians could actually say that they don't understand where the Celtic people came from when you have all this history. They came into Europe because they did not go into the land of Canaan. It's very obvious that's what was going on. And the historians like Keating and Hitti have recorded that information for us. Now, in the Bible, they mention a place called Tarsus, and Tarsus is mentioned several times in the Bible as a shipping port. Now, we don't know exactly where it is, but it's obvious that it had to be somewhere around the area of Iberia. Now, we want to read a scripture that talks about Tarsus, and we're going to start in 2 Chronicles 9:21. Okay, so Joey, can you read the verse for me?
For the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Once every 3 years the merchant ships came, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys.
Now, Hiram was the king of Tyre and probably was a descendant of Esau. And we don't know exactly where they went, but we know that there was ships that came to Tarsus that carried apes, peacocks, and gold and silver. We do not know exactly where Tarsus was, but it's believed to be in Iberia. Now, most of you are going to be familiar with the story of Jonah. Now, it tells us that Jonah rose up to flee from the presence of Yahweh, and he went to Tarsus. So let's just read that real quickly.
Jonah 1 verse 3. But Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of Yahuwah, and he went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. And he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of Yahuwah.
Now, we know there's a connection between the tribe of Benjamin, which was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, as we mentioned earlier, and Benjamin had a son named Tarsus. So there's a connection between Tarsus and the tribe of Benjamin. Now, it's interesting because it's telling you that Dan is not with the rest of the tribes. Now, we know that there was 2 land holdings that Dan had in the land of Israel. Okay, so Joey, can you read a verse for me? Can you read, Joey, can you read Judges 5:17 for me?
Okay, Judges 5:17. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and why did Dan remain in ships? Asher continued at the seashore and stayed by his inlets.
Okay, so what we're told here is that Dan remains in ships. They were a seafaring people and apparently were sailors. Many of them were sailors. Now, the question is, do you have any idea where Dan went? Some of the people from the tribe of Dan were not in those original land holdings for the land of Israel. Now, the Encyclopedia Britannica records the following. The Greeks identified a group of people called the Danaans, who were seafaring people in the Mediterranean Sea area around 1200 BC. Now, keep in mind now that they left out of Egypt in 1496. So by 1200 BC, Dan is already in ships and they're traveling in various other locations. Now, continuing on with what the encyclopedia tells us, in 536 BC, the Persians invaded Scythia and attacked the tribe of Danaan. They're also pronounced Dahay, which is the same group of people, just a different twist on how they pronounce their name. Now, the encyclopedia tells you that Dahay is the same tribe as the Dahan, or the Danaans, which is the tribe that we are talking about originally. That's Danaans. Now, if you remember that the tribe of Dan probably left out and went into the area of Greece because they were not able to conquer the Philistines that lived in the area where they were assigned in the land of Canaan. Now, it's funny that they went into Greece. Now, it's also interesting that the Philistines had also been pushed out of the land of Canaan. Ephraim eventually pushed them out of that area and occupied some of that land. And guess where the Philistines went? In the area right next to Greece, near the area that the tribe of Dan had settled. So one way or the other, Dan had no choice but to deal with the tribe of the Philistines. Now, we believe today that the tribe called the Pelesians that lived in that area were the Philistines. They lived in the Minoan civilization. And we know that because the pottery from that area matches up the pottery that's been found that the Philistines had in the land of Canaan. We also have another reference. The Bible tells us that the Philistines settled in the area around Crete and Cyprus. You can find that in Amos 9:7. Now, there's a famous legend about the tribe of Danaan. There was a father named Danes, had 50 daughters. On coming to Oregon, took up his abode in the city throughout Hellas, which we know is another name for the Greeks, and he laid down the law that hereto any group called Pelesian were to be named Danaans. Now, this quote is taken from Strabo, who was a famous geographer, ancient geographer. Now, as he was making maps, he also wrote bits of history. So they're really recording that Dan went into Greece, which makes perfect sense since he was not able to settle some of his assigned land in the land of Israel. He had to go somewhere. And he went to war with the Philistines. So it's funny how history continues to repeat itself. So these tribes were getting moved out of the area of the Middle East around the Mediterranean Sea area in the beginning, into Spain and into Greece. And we also mentioned that they made a migration into Ireland. And the Danaans also are well known in the area of Ireland. It is recorded that they migrated there. They would call the Tortodonum tribe. And we see it today written in the history of Ireland. We also know that Gathias, which was a son of a Trojan king, went and settled in Ireland. And the people that settled there that were his descendants were called the Milesians. That's Milesian. Now, we also know the story about how Jeremiah brought the two princesses from the land of Israel to the area of Ireland, although that was never written in history. We do have some interesting facts that one of the castles in Ireland is called the Dublin Castle, has a bust of Jeremiah in the castle. And there's two stones also found that record the voyage of Jeremiah to the land of Ireland. But we do not have that record recorded in Irish history. Now you can see the stones today that recorded the trip of Jeremiah from the land of Israel to Ireland in a park in Ireland called Long Cruise. Now I think it's really interesting that we have that kind of information available to us today. And by the way, all the queens of England believed it. And Queen Victoria told the people the story of Tia, the princess that came to Ireland. We also know that the tribe of Asher, another son of Jacob, went to the tip of Britain and formed a tin manufacturing business in the area around Cornwall. Now, this information is well documented by historians. They know about the tin manufacturing that went on in the area of Cornwall, and that there was a tribe there named Asher. Now, this information has just been left out. People have not made the connection that these are Israelites, and they want to leave the Bible out. As simple as that. And it's impossible to fully understand history without understanding the history of the Israelites. When you leave them out, there's a huge gap in history. The point is the tribes had already started migrating before the time they went into the land of Canaan. They had already started migrating. That is the point I want to make. Before the captivity was in place, many of the people had already migrated out. We also had a migration after they left out of Egypt. Now, I see it's time that we need to take a little break. And before we break, though, I'd like to mention to you that my website is 12 Tribe History. So you can find all the references and information that I cover in this program on that website. So if you have any questions, also feel free to contact me. I have a link to my email on that website. Now, just to recap a little before we break, we just want to mention that we covered how the tribe of Dan went into Greece. We covered how the tribe of Gad went into Spain. And we also mentioned that Asher went into the area of England at the tip of England in a place called Cornwall. So the next place we want to talk about is Carthage. Now we know there was a huge migration that occurred around 800 BC, and that is the time frame when King Ahab was reigning over Israel. Now, Joey, we know that many of the people left out of the land of Israel during the reign of King Ahab. Do you have any idea why they left?
Yeah, they left because they were hungry. There was a famine in the land.
Exactly.
They were probably thirsty too.
Absolutely. There was a huge famine in the land, and it was so severe that when King Ahab wanted to muster an army, he could only find 7,000 troops. Joy, can you read 1 Kings 20, verse 15?
1 Kings 20:15.
Mm-hmm.
Then he mustered the young leaders of the provinces, and there were 232. 232, and after them he mustered all the people of the children of Israel, 7,000.
Now, this famine lasted 3.5 years, and it was so severe that many of the people moved out of the land of Israel. Now, one of the places they migrated to was around the area of Carthage. Now, you remember the story of David. David could literally put 1.5 million men on the battlefield. That's how many people were in the land of Israel at that time. It was millions of people. Now, when David brought his troops out, the people in the Middle East just shook because it was such an incredible army. Now, it's unbelievable that David could put 1.5 million people on the battlefield, but that's what he did. So David actually ruled the entire Middle East, and the people in the surrounding areas paid tribute to him. So you go from 1.5 million people under King David, and Ahab can only muster 7,000. This is incredible. That's a huge drop in population. Now you remember when the 10 tribes of Israel and the tribe of Judah split, many of the Torah keepers went and lived in the land of Judah. But they still outnumbered Judah 2-1, and they were the larger tribe. Now let's get back to the Phoenicians. Now we know that the people that lived in the land of Phoenicia were not the Israelites. In fact, many of them were the Canaanites. But we do know that the Phoenicians had Israelites in their communities. But Carthage was an Israelite town. Now, Carthage got its name from the Greeks, but that's not what the people in Carthage called themselves. The people called themselves Caria Hadashah, which in Hebrew means a new city, or it means the people of the book. And that book that they're talking about would have been the Bible. Now, that name was used in many other Israelite cities. You can find it in Joshua 15 and chapter 20. Now, Carthage was originally settled around 1100 BC, and its first ruler was a woman named Dido. Now, she is mentioned in a book written in the 1st century by Virgil called Aeneas, and she is described as a beautiful princess. Now, according to Virgil, she had a love affair with Aeneas, who was the founder of Rome. And Josephus also described her as a princess with blonde hair and blue eyes. Now, I believe that's the only thing in specific he mentioned about her. Now, Israel had a lot of female rulers, and we'll cover that at some session in the future. Now, the reason I say that Carthage was an Israelite city is that there was many similarities between the people in Carthage and the Israelites. Now, one of those similarities was the language. Many of the people in Carthage spoke Hebrew. Now, George Rawlinson was the historian that wrote about Carthage, and I want to read you something he wrote. The Phoenicians spoke a Semitic language closely aligned to the Hebrew. A good Hebrew scholar has no difficulty understanding any legitimate Phoenician inscription. We know that the Carthaginians spoke Punic Iberian language, and that language had many Hebrew words. So the question is, how did they get Hebrew words? It's obvious they had to have a lot of Israelites that lived in that area. That's the only possible and logical explanation. This is a major proof that the Israelites lived in that area. There's no other logical explanation. Now let's switch gears here and let's talk about another proof that the Israelites lived in that area. Now we want to talk about another similarity they had with the Israelites, and that is their sacrificial system. Now they had a sacrificial system that was very similar to the one that was in the land of Israel. Now when they first got started, I'm sure they did a really good job, but eventually it turned into human sacrifice. But in the very beginning, they were mimicking the sacrificial system that was in the land of Israel. We can see that. They even wore the same costumes and uniforms. Now, I also want to make a comment about them being Baal worshippers. They learned how to worship Baal from the Canaanites, and this was the reason why God told them not to mix with the Canaanites. The Canaanites had always had human sacrifice as part of their worship. Now let's move on and talk about how Carthage was a seafaring people. Now, Carthage did not allow the passage of ships in or through the Mediterranean Sea area. Now, they completely controlled the Mediterranean Sea. Now, many of you remember the story from the Dark Ages about how the people who believed that the earth was round were persecuted because the people in the Catholic Church believed that it was flat. Everybody believed that the earth was flat at that time, and if you taught something different, you could be killed. Now, that belief came from Carthage. Carthage told the people that if they sailed too far out into the Atlantic Ocean, they could fall off. Now, the Carthaginians did that because they wanted to keep the people out of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, they did that to discourage the people from sailing into the Atlantic Ocean so they could maintain their trade routes. Now, this caused the Greeks and the Romans to be landlocked, and this is the reason why the Greeks and Romans literally hated the Carthaginians. They couldn't get out of the Mediterranean Sea because Carthage had complete control over the sea. Now, I find it interesting that Abraham was promised that his descendants would have control over the gates of their enemies, and that is really
Linda, that's one of the sea gates as well that Israel was promised. That's a fascinating study. Maybe one day we need to do a program on the sea gates.
That would be true. Well, do you want to tell the audience a little bit about that?
Well, it's in Genesis where one of the prophecies, it is a prophecy and it's a blessing where Yahweh says to Abraham that he and his seed will have possession of the gates of his enemies, both land and sea. And that has been, when you run the history of the Israelites down, you will find until just recently, and of course we can talk about why they've lost them, but until just recently in the past 50 years or so, the Anglo-Saxon Celtic peoples have had control of all of the major gates in the world. And the gates are power. They're shipping lanes, they're land gates. It's always a source of wealth to have control of those very specific gates, both on the land and the sea. And of course, you and I are in agreement that we've lost them because of sin. Our peoples have turned away from the Father, and the blessings have just run out. So that's it in a nutshell.
And that's exactly what has happened here. Although today we've lost many of those gates because of our sins. Now we want to get to another proof that Carthage was an Israelite city. So in 2 Samuel 24:4, there's an account of David taking a census of the people of Israel. So, Joey, would you mind reading that verse for us now?
Okay, 2 Samuel 24, verse 4. Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab and against the captains of the army. Therefore Joab and the captains of the army went out from the presence of the king to count the people of Israel.
Okay, now also, can you read 2 Samuel 24:7?
And they came to the stronghold of Tyre and to all the cities of the Hivites and the Canaanites, and they went out to South Judah as far as Beersheba.
Now, this is the story of David taking a census of the land of Israel. And they counted the Israelites in the cities of Tyre and Sidon. Now, this proved that they had Israelites living among the Phoenicians. Now, you remember Carthage made up this story about if you sail too far out into the Atlantic, you'll fall off. And this kept the people from knowing the trade route to the New World. So next we want to prove that the Carthaginians and many of the people in the Phoenician area were selling to the New World, which was America. Now we talked about how the people from the land of Phoenicia would take these long trips and they would go for like 3 years and they'd come back with ivory and gold and peacocks, and the scripture talked in detail about that. It references the ships of Hiram, which was the ruler of Tyre during the time of David. So this is proof that there was Israelites in the land of Phoenicia around the area of Tyre and Sidon, because that was one of the areas that David did a census in, that they counted the Israelites. And so they counted the Israelites among the people in Tyre and Sidon. And the Phoenicians, we know, were a seafaring people. History mentions that. And the Bible mentions that they took long trips for 3 years. So the question remains, where did these people go? They were making trips outside of the Mediterranean Sea. So where did these people go? So that's what we want to get into now and answer that question. We know there is historical proof that they went to America. So I want to read you some interesting information. Now, Aristotle recorded some information about America. Now, Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great. We know that. So I want to read you what Aristotle wrote. In the sea outside of the Pillars of Hercules, that's Gibraltar, they say that there's an island found by the Carthaginians, a wilderness having woods of all kinds and navigable rivers, remarkable for various kinds of fruit and many days' sailing distance away. When the Carthaginians, who were the masters of the Western Ocean, observed that many traders and others, attracted by the fertility of the soil and the pleasant climate, they feared that the knowledge of the land would reach other nations. Therefore, the Carthaginian Empire issued a decree that no one under penalty of death should thereof sail thither. Now, I think that's interesting because it says several things. It was a place that was in the Western Ocean, that was many days sailing away. It was fruitful in a fertile soil. Now, Aristotle didn't know where that was, obviously, but the people of the land of Phoenicia knew because they sailed there. And it's obvious they did not want people to know where this place was. Now, we've been told by Nigel Davies in his book called The Voyage to the New World that 30,000 people sailed in 60 ships to America. But the historians today don't believe this information. They don't believe the history records where Hanno had actually brought the people in the ships to America. They said there's no way that they would have had the seafaring ability to go that distance at that length of time. And now, it shouldn't be a surprise to any of us that the historians today deny this account. They don't want any information linking back to the land of Israel and the Israelites. Plain and simple. Now, I want to read you what another historian wrote, and this is Diodorus. Now, Diodorus was a Greek historian, and he wrote the following. Over against Africa lies a vast, great island in the vast sea, many days' sail from Libya westward. The soil there is very fertile, a great part thereof is mountainous, but much like is a plain which is most sweet and pleasant part, for it is watered with several navigable rivers. Now there's also a book put out by Barry Feld, who is an archaeologist and professor at Harvard University, and it's called BC America. And that book talks about how they took copper out of the Great Lakes around Lake Superior. And he records that it was taken out around the same time frame that King David reigned, which is 1000 BC. Now, they know that people were here because they have evidence on tablets that they found in America. One is called the Decalogue tablet that is written in Hebrew. Another one was called the Mystery Hill inscription, found in America, also written in Hebrew. Now, the most important finding was in West Virginia, and that was called the Grave Creek Mound tablet. The inscriptions on the gravestones were written in Punic Iberian language, which dates back to that same time frame around 1000 BC and the time of David, where they would have been speaking the Punic Iberian language. So they know people were here. They know that they came during this time frame. They know that they spoke the Punic Iberian language, and they know the Iberian language that we're talking about dates back to the time of the Phoenician Empire. Now, at first they thought it was Indian tombstones that they found in West Virginia. It's found in a state park in Moundsville, Virginia. It's called Grave Creek Mound National Park. So they thought it was Indian translations on the tombstones, but later they found out it was Punic Iberian language. So there's some other interesting findings that we want to mention. In 1874, a stilt was found containing ancient language. It was found in Iowa. It dates back to 900 BC, again the same time frame as King David. Many of you have probably heard of the Los Lonas inscription. It dates back to 1000 BC also. It's found in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This was a stone with the 10 Commandments written on it that are written in Hebrew. It was not translated until 1949. The age of the stone is basically unknown, but it was found by some Boy Scouts, and they washed off the stone so they could read it better. And when they did, it prevented the archaeologists from being able to date it properly. Now, there was a finding in Susquehanna Valley. It dates back to 800 BC also. It contains hundreds of grave markers found with the inscriptions of Celtic and Phoenician headstones. Now, archaeologists tell us that there was a group of people called the Hopewell people, and they joined with the Adena people who were already in the Ohio Valley. Those people, the Adena people, were probably the people that were here during the time of David, and they stayed. And the Hopewell people are the people that came much later, and they joined with the Adena people. Now, their migration coincides with the Punic Wars between Carthage and Rome, which would have occurred around 145 BC. Tablet called the Greek Creek Mound, written in Punic Iberian language, which we talked about before, backs up that information. So you can see there are many findings and much archaeological information that we can cover that talks about the Phoenicians and Israelites being in the land of America. They even found Egyptian writing on some of the stones around the island of New York, Manhattan Island. Now, you know, we mentioned about the copper mines around the Lake Superior, and we mentioned that there was an expedition that was brought by Roy Dyer. He found that they had at least 500 million pounds of copper that was removed out of the region and the mines around Lake Superior. So there's just many, many records about our people and the Phoenicians coming to this land. So why do we teach this? And the reason we teach it is so that people will understand that they need to return back to the covenant. That's the whole reason. Once the people in this nation and other nations realize that their ancestors were Abraham, that they come from the family and descendants of Abraham, and that their people kept Torah for thousands of years and kept the Sabbath and kept the holy days, then they will understand that they need to return back to the covenant that was given to their forefathers. Now, God wants all these Israelite nations to return back to the covenant that was made at the Mount Sinai. Now, I'm going to start reading in Deuteronomy 29:12. Thou shouldest enter into this covenant with Yahweh thy God, and into his oath which the Lord thy God made with thee this day. And dropping down to verse 14. Neither with you only do I make this covenant and this oath, but with him that stands here with us this day before Yahweh our God, but also with him that is not here with us today. So it is for the people that were there at Mount Sinai, and it was for the people that weren't there at Mount Sinai. It was for the children of Abraham, and we are the children of Abraham. And once our people realize that our ancestors kept the Sabbath into the 13th century, which they did in England and in Scotland and in Ireland to the 13th century, and the holy days, and that it's a new thing to keep the pagan festivals that we have now. Those have been added by the Catholic Church. Once they realize that, they will return back to what their ancestors believed and did, which is Torah. Now I want to make another point, that it plainly says that God took away the job from the Pharisees, and it says that it gave it to a more holy nation. Well, that's these Israelite nations. They had a job and a responsibility. Their job and responsibility was to teach Torah to the rest of the nation, and they didn't do that. And how could they possibly know that they're supposed to do it? Because they don't even know that they're Israelites, that they're actually in covenant. They don't understand that. Now, Solomon was told that when you prosper, and the other nations come to you and they asked you, why are you so prosperous? You tell them about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that they need to keep the laws of Torah, the Bible, the scriptures. Now, I know that many people, once they learn their identity, they will return back to the teachings of the covenant. They will do that. But we as a people need to understand we have a job and we have a responsibility, all of us. So why did he tell Solomon? Because he wants the people that are the Gentile nations to come into covenant also. That's the whole purpose. He wants everybody to be in covenant. Now, if you want to check some references on the information that I taught tonight, you could go out to my website, which is 12 Tribe History, number 12 Tribe History. And you can go out on my article page and you'll see the information out there on the earliest migrations. Well, now I see that we've run out of time now, and I want to thank Joey for coming on with me, and I want to say good night and blessings to all.